All right, welcome back to, I don't know if this is Fantasy Labs podcast or just a video or what this is really. We decided, I'm here with Jay and Justin, obviously you can see them. And we decided to do kind of an impromptu strategy video podcast, whatever, where we kind of just give our thoughts on our models and kind of how to use them, and then kind of just basic NBA DFS strategy. Justin and I had kind of initially talked about this when he first came on before the NBA season, but we haven't really talked about it since then. So we do kind of want to reevaluate some of those ideas and kind of just talk about some questions that we've been getting from users. So we'll kind of dive into it. And I guess we'll kind of just start with some questions that we've been getting. And I think a good place to start is kind of just how we approach building our own models and our own lineups as guys who play DFS a lot. Obviously, this is our job. So Jay, you're probably the heaviest volume guy out of the three of us. So what does your kind of day look like as far as building lineups for NBA?
Yeah, I mean, NBA is just so different from other sports. So much changes throughout the day. So, my day broken down really is I obviously have to start with a Mountain Dew, kickstart that day, get things going. But really, in the morning, you're not going to have your lineup, set really. I do research overnight, obviously, just breaking down matchups and which players you can, find value in based on possible injuries, 50-50 guys. But really in the morning, you want to catch up on the kind of the landscape of the slate, break it down by game, position, whatever you want. But you have to understand so much changes throughout the day. You got to be on top of, our Twitter feed all day is a great start. People ask us a lot, why are the models changing throughout the day? And, it's simple that there's so much stuff going on. Even one guy being out, that affects, four other starters on that team, the reserve guy coming in for that guy, the other team, the lines, everything really. So it's kind of a domino effect. So, and even like a guy who plays 12 minutes a game can bump someone up significantly. So I think it's important really to be patient, especially in the mornings with your slates.
Yeah, and I'll build off that. And in addition to being patient, I think you have to be flexible as well, and be able to kind of adjust your lineup and be able to, the NBA is really the only sport where you can do, 4 or 5 hours of research in the morning, then have it all scrapped and have to start from brand new lineup, an hour or two before lock. So it's important to just come in with, I think, a list of targets that you like, some building blocks for sure, your top cash game plays, your studs, and then some bargains that stick out. And then I think also in relation to like the injury stuff, you want to just be writing that stuff down and then kind of writing down like who benefits if X player is out, X player is scratched, just so you're prepared in case that stuff does happen, that you can kind of pivot and switch up your strategy on the fly. I think one thing that Bryan, myself, and Jay talk a lot about on the pod is kind of implied team total for Vegas, and especially with basketball, with usage and that stuff being really important. Targeting guys in those high total games is just a really good place to start. Just kind of like going through the order of the implied team totals and kind of identifying players from those teams that are implied for the most points is a good place to start for sure.
Right. And then, another huge thing I think is you have to obviously break it down. Are you playing tournaments? Are you more of a tournament player, or are you playing cash games, 50-50s, double ups, head-to-heads? They're almost, for me, I've been a cash game player pretty much ever since. It's just the way I work better as a cash player, but that's something you really have to distinguish, plays like on the pod tonight. Me and Bryan talked about a few players where, we're like, I'm never going to roster this guy in cash, but I love him for tournaments. So some of you might be like, well, that doesn't make sense, but tournament, you're not, at least for me, when I do play them, I'm not as price sensitive. So for, chalky values, guys that are pretty clear-cut plays, you don't need to play them as much in tournaments, and you can take chances on those guys, Tim Duncans, the guys who can put up huge lines if they are in close game and play big minutes. So playing tournaments and cash, it's really two separate things, especially for NBA. It's also separate with your research. You're focusing on so many more things for tournaments, and they're honestly really hard to handle for basketball with the amount of scratches and injuries. So that's something I think, game selection and what works better for you with your research if you want to play cash or tournament. And if you play both, you got to separate it and how you handle each move throughout the day.
Yeah, and I think Bryan and I are kind of Bryan Jay versus me and Jay versus Bryan are kind of a good example of that dichotomy. I think Bryan's definitely more of a tournament player in the way he thinks and breaks down the games, and Jay and I are definitely more cash oriented. And you don't have to be good at both. I don't try to be a tournament player because I think it's probably minus EV for me to get my money in there versus cash. And like Jay said, it's really different on like what you emphasize and what you look for. With even cash, it's broken down into kind of two things. It's head-to-heads and 50-50s. And 50-50s especially, you're just basically looking for floor. So you're basically just trying to beat 50% of the field and just trying to let them make all the mistakes. And if you just build a clean lineup with a bunch of guys who hit singles and doubles and kind of hit their value without having a flashy ceiling on top of that, and just kind of are able to hit those guys, then that's pretty much the ideal type of strategy you want to be looking for. And head to head, you kind of want to mix it a little bit because if you're playing 100 head to heads and you win 55 versus winning 80. There's a big difference there in terms of the money that you're going to win. And 50-50s, if you're cashing, first place gets the same place as the guy right above the bubble. So in head-to-heads, you want to be looking, with those floor guys with upside on top of that as well.
Right.
Yeah. And I will say that I get a lot of questions about people asking like whether they should play 50-50s or head-to-heads. And I really think it depends on your volume. Like I talk to a lot of people who play low volume, and there's no shame in that. Like there's a lot of people who play really, really high volume, and there's people who just do it for fun and play like 10 games a night, 10 head-to-heads, whatever. But I think in general, if you're playing low volume, like if you're only going to put in like less than $100 a night, which is perfectly fine, then you probably shouldn't play head-to-heads. You should play 50-50s, just because that is going to minimize your risk. If you're going to play a high volume, then obviously you can, benefit from the upside of, the fact that if you hit 60% of, like you're in the 60th percentile, then obviously you're going to make 60% of the money. Whereas in the head-to-heads, you could be in the 99th percentile and you're still only going to make 50% of the money. So I think it really depends on your volume. And I think that we've been talking about that is you just need to be self-aware of what you're good at. And like some people are really good at head-to-head. Honestly, I don't think there's many people out there that are really good at both head-to-heads and tournaments or cash games versus tournaments. And I think that's fine. You just got to be self-aware and like understand that you're not good at the other and kind of load up on the other. And there's no shame in really being better at the other one. I mean, obviously both make money. But yeah, it's just kind of knowing your strength and, knowing where your strengths are, I think is kind of step number one to identify. Like, obviously like our models help you identify the best plays, but bankroll management and kind of just even identifying the contest type is really step number one before you even think about players every day.
Yeah. Game selection is always, super underrated. People jump in games, if you're playing $100, you want to play the highest entries available for guaranteed. You want that break-even line to be as low as it can get. So you don't need to load up on 20-man 50-50s when you can have, a double up with 25,000 people.
Yep.
But it's all about bankroll and separating, what games you want to play. And that's kind of the first step. And it works, nightly basis where that's something you can just get used to. And, you don't have to like bum hunt or anything.
Mm-hmm.
but there are ways you can be plus EV compared to just throwing random entries in.
Yeah.
So let's start with cash games first and talk about just general strategy and how we use Fantasy Labs in constructing our cash game lineups. Just general player type. Yeah, Jay, I'll toss it to you, then you can toss it back about kind of the status and how that plays into whether or not you're willing to play a player in cash.
Yeah, so it depends if you play on both sites. Obviously, they have different scoring and pricing. I play on both sides, so I take them one at a time. I don't like to think of, I'm playing Harden on FanDuel. That means I'm playing him on DraftKings. They can be totally different. But as far as rostering a guy in cash, one of the biggest things is just making sure, like Justin said, that they have a floor that you can handle. A lot of my worst nights in cash are when I take a bench player, assuming he's going to get a lot of minutes, 25 or so, and he doesn't. And that's a floor that really cripples you in cash. So, like for example, tomorrow Rondo is 9,300. He's priced heavy, but his floor is really high. So if you're, he might not be the best value. He might not show up in the model as the best value. But when you're constructing your roster, that floor is valuable in cash games because you're getting that.
Yeah, in terms of how I use labs for cash games, I usually just kind of sort by floor projection first, and then kind of look at the corresponding ratings on the left, and kind of just go through and see which guys offer the best combination of rating, ceiling, and floor, with floor being kind of the default sort there. Downside is a big thing, and playing guys that are up in the air, their status is up in the air. They might be a late scratcher, they're coming off an injury or something like that, where it can limit or affect their value, and you're not 100% confident in them coming in. Those are the types of players you generally want to avoid in cash because generally you don't really need that ceiling, that you don't really need to take that risk in the first place. And there are plenty of other options that are, maybe give you a ceiling of 2 fewer points, but their floor and their reliability and their consistency is a lot higher than the alternative.
Right. And yeah, when I use the models, I go position by position really and kind of pinpoint plays that stand out to me, great plays. But yeah, absolutely. If a guy if he's even not on the injury report or he got, dinged up, he has a lingering injury, that's enough. That's easy enough to just write him off. There is no upside. There are guys to pivot to, and obviously tournament wise, that's when you kind of bank on it. Having guys questionable who might be 1 or 2% owned is huge, but cash, that's something some of the worst nights you can have are when you have a late scratch, but there's nothing you could do, on FanDuel with late scratches, but there is something you could do with guys who are questionable, even if they're leaning towards probable. It's just they're not 100%, and that's something that you can easily write off early in the day if they're questionable.
You got anything to add, Bryan?
No. I mean, I obviously you said that I'm not the biggest cash guy.
I'll take it back. Yeah. So another thing for cash, site dependent. The roster's composition is totally different. You have 2 small forwards, you have 2 power forwards on FanDuel, so 2 shooting guards. Whereas DraftKings, you generally, at least this year, even last year, for your utility, your guard spot, even your forward spot, you can play multiple point guards that are great value. You can play multiple centers. So one big thing for FanDuel is, when there's a cheap center available, and centers really have low floors. They're more prone to foul trouble. They're not as offensively aggressive. So
Karl Anthony Towns,
foul trouble. But I mean, for a guy, like 3,600 or something, and you have a center, even like Biyombo, he's got a really low floor. And I think going him more than not at this level when you have value at center as often as we have this season, I don't think is a good idea to, you don't have to risk it going a cheap center. like you can maybe on DraftKings in your secondary spot, where it's a little, different there. So knowing which site caters to positional value is also, huge for cash games.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with kind of just the nature of the positions. Point guards by nature have a higher floor because they have the ball in their hands a lot more often, and they can kind of control their own, I don't know, not their own destiny, but kind of have a real say in their value and be involved. They're going to be involved in every play. Big men can get in foul trouble, like Jay said, or they can go extended stretches without really touching the ball on offense, or the ball caroms off the rim a certain way and they're not getting rebounds. So I totally agree. I think what Jay you're saying is that you on FanDuel you're more willing to pay up at center rather than to go cheap, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, right. And I am almost generally even small forward too, like some nights Batum or someone where, especially shorter slates, you have these 5 to 7 game slates and whatnot, that there isn't going to be that much value and you're not going to have a great play for every position. It's very rare when that happens. So sometimes you're kind of going to have to take a salary value hit by getting a more consistent floor. And, he might not show up as the greatest value because he's just not, but the way your roster's set up, it allows you to get a high floor for each position. I think that's arguably more important.
I totally agree. I think if you're looking at one kind of nuance that Jay just said that you can apply to when using Fantasy Labs is that you'll see a guy with maybe a floor of like 18 points and his rating is 65, not great. And you see a guy with a floor of like 11 and his rating is 80. It's not always good. It's not always the right call in cash to play that guy with the floor of 11 with the higher rating than the guy with the floor of 18 but the lower rating, because you want to, like you said, you want to pay up a little bit for that security, because if you get one hole in your cash lineup, that definitely could be enough to kind of sink your entire night.
Yeah, absolutely. And if for whatever models you guys are using, and you don't like that some of these cheap guys are showing at the top of the models, I mean, that's the way, before Fantasy Labs and I had my own models, that cheap guys would always show up at top value-wise because they don't need to get that many points to pay off their price, especially, DraftKings 3K guy. So you can always alter the sliders too to get, rate floor higher, or, build it a little more to where when you do look at the models, when everything's set, you kind of are like, okay,
yeah,
I know why this guy's rated where he is.
Yeah, and that's really like the biggest drawback of just a straight points per dollar type rating system, is because it doesn't factor in that nuance. It doesn't factor in the floor and the downside. And that's really something you have to take into consideration. I think people are just kind of looking at, okay, this guy's 3,200 and, he could put up 18 DraftKings points, which puts his points per dollar pretty high, right? But like definitely has a possibility to give you like 10 or single digits in kind of a realistic worst case. So I think definitely the player models on Labs allows you to add that extra layer that traditional just straight projection systems don't allow you to.
Yeah, and I would add that I think in cash games you should be more price sensitive across sites, and I think that's kind of like a next level thing that people, if you want to kind of take your cash games to the next level, is there's a lot of people who, all right, so let's say a point guard's going against Portland. Like, we know that's a really good play because Portland can't defend point guards. But a lot of people who play both sites will play them on both FanDuel and DraftKings kind of independently of whether one is super overpriced on DraftKings as opposed to FanDuel, whereas your elite cash game players will really focus on the price and will minimize his exposure on the site where he's more expensive, just because it changes a lot of roster construction. And so I think that you could have a guy who's a really good play, and you don't have to play the same sort of guys in cash lineups on both sides. Whereas I think that you could get an edge because a lot of people will probably play the same core guys on both sites, regardless of whether they're priced similarly or not.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of use our bargain rating as a great way to really gauge that and get a really good idea of how a player's salary compares from one side to the other, and whether you should get your exposure to him maybe on both sides or just on DraftKings or just on FanDuel. Rondo it's kind of a good example. This is the one that comes up first in my memory. Him being 8K on FanDuel recently versus 9K on DraftKings. He's probably a top 5 cash game play on FanDuel, but probably not top 3 at his position on DraftKings at his price. So it really changes from side to side. And I like what Jay said earlier about really doing each side individually and just doing like 2 different processes for each side, and not having like your plays from one provider bleed into the other and kind of overlap just because you like that player.
Yep.
Yeah, and that happens often. You know, a lot of people do that playing on both sides. They'll overlap almost all their guys. And, you know, on very short slates, you can get away with it a little more so. But on a 12-game slate, you know, a lot of things have to go right for you to really have majority of your team similar, because a lot of plays are pricing based.
Yeah.
All right, so let's switch gears here to tournaments, and I'll kick this off with just like a conceptual idea of like what the difference is for me. And I think you generally, this is like being a little bit simplistic, but you generally want to take like your cash game strategy and flip it on its head, and that goes from like a lot of different new parts of putting your lineup together. For example, if the slate for cash is really like stars and scrubs heavy, there's a lot of really good bargain players on that slate, and then you got your studs who are just like not Anthony Davis. He's a bad example because of injury, but like Steph Curry, LeBron James, DeMarcus Cousins. So you have like really strong stars and really good scrub plays. You want to if you identify that as being the favored cash game strategy, then you want to go more like mid-price guys in tournaments and just kind of like vary up the roster construction there, because you don't want, like, a lot of people like take the same roster construction that they do in cash games and then carry that over to tournaments. And I think a really good way to differentiate yourself is if you got a stud at 9,500 that everybody likes, you can differentiate yourself by playing that guy at 8,500 who's going to be less owned.
Right. Even more so, I even really like doing the opposite of that. And you have a guy at 8,500 who a lot of people are on because he's cheap. Pay the guy who's like 9,100, who people think is overvalued. Like, a Paul Millsap, for example, if Porzingis is 1,400 cheaper or something at power forward, where you think a lot of people can't really pass up Porzingis' price, but then you have Millsap there who, sure, this guy might be overpriced, but that's something to look at less in tournaments because you're trying to find, lower owned guys to propel you to the top. The other thing with tournaments is it's huge what tournament you're playing, what buy-in level. So if you're playing a 100,000 person tournament, it's a whole different strategy than if you're playing in, the Baller or something where it's $1,000 buy-in, a couple hundred people or whatnot. You can get away with a more cash game oriented tournament team in smaller tournament fields compared to like a huge tournament. You're going to have guys where you will easily write them off with your cash game thinking analysis. Like, okay, this guy's overpriced. He has a very low floor, so I'm writing him off in cash. Then that makes him a great tournament play if his ceiling is there.
Yeah, I actually think that you should be so I guess the popular thing to say is that you shouldn't be price sensitive in tournaments, but you should in cash games. I think I disagree a little bit in that. I think in tournaments you should be price sensitive. So kind of the way that I put together tournament lineups, and especially like if I'm multi-entering like a lot of lineups into a tournament, instead of focusing on the floor, I'll sort by projected plus minus, because that gives me the best values, and it's usually guys kind of in the mid range, and so it helps me build my core guys that I want And then so I can focus on like maybe 3 or 4 core guys that I want to get most of my exposure to in lineups. And then so I can be price sensitive in that way. But then after that, I can be completely non-price sensitive and just I don't care about matchups. I don't care about anything else other than just creating unique lineups on top of my core. So I'll lock in those guys that have like a really high projected plus minus, whether it was Porzingis the other night or Tristan Thompson or whoever it may be, or Rondo or Nkemba the other night. I'll lock in those guys and put a lot of them in the majority of my lineups, and then just go super contrarian and non-price sensitive with the rest of my lineups and just kind of filter guys around my core. So I think in tournaments, it's not necessarily not being price sensitive. It's just being not price sensitive with your contrarian plays, obviously.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to be contrarian from 1 through 9 in your lineup. I think you definitely want some chalk in there just because like you want some semblance of a floor. You just don't want to have like 9 complete boom or bust guys because the chances of all those guys hitting on the same night are pretty slim. That's probably something you want to do more in like the 100,000 entry fields where you kind of really have to hit it out of the park to cash high. But generally, it's fine to have a couple chalky plays in there. You know, like Bryan said, where you short by projected plus minus, and you're putting in some more popular mid-range bargain type players in there first, and then like you said, you just kind of you have your core, and then you kind of play around and put different players around that core, you know, until you get the number of iterations of lineups you want.
Yeah, and I don't even necessarily think it's a floor thing. I think it's a value thing. Because there are guys that have a high floor that I'm like more interested in cash games. But that doesn't necessarily mean their value. Whereas tournament, I'm not necessarily like sorting by floor. I'm more sorting by value. And the best value thing metric we have is the projected plus minus. And so kind of regardless of their floor, usually they kind of naturally have a high floor because of where they are in relation to their salary. And usually a lot of those guys make up, I usually take maybe 1 or 2 of those guys plus maybe my favorite kind of mid-tier guys that I really believe in their matchup, and kind of lock in those 4 guys to, I don't know, like over half of my lineups, and then kind of differentiate around that.
Yeah, and you know, like I said before, the tournament size plays a big factor there are plenty of tournaments where I agree locking in a core, or, you know, 4 guys and then having a ton of combinations is a great strategy. But you got to understand some tournaments are so top heavy that, you know, maybe you do just want to have a ton of random lineups out there. You know, you're playing for first place, but with the core, you know, you save yourself because if that core goes off, you know, you have such a strong option, so many possibilities to cash. And another thing with tournaments, you know, is you got to understand like game outcomes. You got to read into the game script. Some of the best tournament players will really break a game down and have different scenarios for each game. Like if so-and-so, you know, blows them out, how thin is their bench for their backups? You know, how many minutes is Waiters going to go? Who's the second unit that he'll play against in case of a blowout? Can he be aggressive? Is he going to get locked down? You know, there's so many things where you can figure that stuff out. So when that does happen, or even, you know, games that have 12-point spreads, if you want to say, okay, I think it's going to be close, then you can play starters in that game where more people would fade them, you know, Durant or Westbrook in a 15-point spread and go their bench guys, but you can play them if you think, you know, there's a chance the game, it's NBA, you know, obviously games can turn out anyway. So I think understanding the game script for a lot of games and the variance in outcomes is a huge advantage.
Let me ask you one question, Jay, then we can circle back to that because I think there's a lot more to parse about that aspect. So for someone with, I don't know, like a couple $100 bankroll, nothing too big. What advice would you give them when constructing tournament lineups? Because I know like a lot of these guys can't afford to put like 10 plus lineups into it, and they also can't really afford to put those like total off the wall lineups as well, because they just aren't like blowing a couple of dollars to them isn't really ideal. So what advice would you have for those types of players, which I think make up like a good chunk of people who play?
I was one not too long ago.
Yeah, they do. You know, my honest advice, if you're playing small and you want, a lot of people have different ideas. Some people want that quick 20K, I'm just playing for that. I don't care. I'll reload my account. Some people want that slow grind. I want to build. I want to cash. And I think it's a different mindset. But, my honest advice would be to really hunt for overlay if you're playing tournaments strictly. There are late slates. There are slates that, I write them off. I'm not going to play every slate. A lot of people don't. So some nights, you have a Tuesday night, 3-game late night slate. Some of those are the best, plus EV scenarios you can get in. You don't have to throw your $3 entry in a tournament with 100,000 people when it fills 3 hours before tip-off. If you are throwing one entry in those, you're not going to take as many chances. You're not going to build your lineups where you're saying, okay, I'm going to hedge this lineup and back this scenario up. So single entry, you got to think of it at ownership levels. You can't go all chalk. Obviously, you're never going to win that way with a single entry. So you do have to have guys, you got to take chances, and you got to understand you're not going to cash every night. Your ROI in tournaments is high, but you're going to have more losing nights consecutively. So you have to understand your bankroll. You might want to, bet a smaller portion of your bankroll at first, because you don't know how long it is before you kind of cash a score that bumps your ROI up.
And tournaments especially are a lot harder to master than cash. I think cash is fairly straightforward. You play the best players, and it's all about predicting value. And just like, if you can nail projections, really, then you're going to be a profitable cash player. Being profitable in tournaments is so much more. It's about roster construction. It's about predicting ownership. It's about being contrarian. It's about a lot. It's a lot harder to be, in my opinion, like an elite tournament player, because it just requires so much more strategy, and so much more in terms of work in putting multiple iterations of lineups together, having to pivot and switch when all the injury stuff hits. Like it's a challenge. It's a big challenge.
But I think it really just, I think it's part like your personality. Like for me, like you guys describe like cash games and how like it's stressful for you to play tournaments. But honestly, like my personality is, it's stressful for me to play cash games, to have all of my money tied up in one lineup. Like I like having my money spread out among different lineups where like I can hedge in a bunch of different ways. So like I guess I could give different advice in that. My advice would be, because I was there at one point. I deposited $25 and built it up just playing tournaments. And I would say that try to get in as much things as you can. Like don't like if you're going to put $20 into a tournament for that night, like if you say I'm going to put $20 in tournaments, don't put one lineup that's $20. I mean, maybe the top person's going to get more money or whatever, but I would say like put the $2, like enter the $2 tournament and put 10 lineups in and build your core, and then go contrarian and just kind of work it out that way where you can hedge and maybe hit one, because the chances when you're first beginning of hitting on just one lineup is slim, even for the best players, let alone if you're just starting. So I would say just kind of distribute as much as you can, and it doesn't mean that you have to put in more money, just go smaller stakes.
Yeah, I completely agree. Starting out, it's really hard. A lot of people see other people having tournament success, but some of these large fields, yeah, you're right. The best player in NBA DFS is not going to cash all the time with one lineup or two lineups. It's just not doable. So many variables. So I think having the right mentality along with the right strategy, exploiting matchups, thin benches. If you're going to play a bench guy, you better assume for the greater part that he's going to get minutes if you want to go that route. You really have to break it down really well. I wouldn't just kind of throw players around randomly in 100,000 person because you think, yeah, okay, that top lineup. But more often than not, I find myself looking at teams that won, and you say, okay, this this actually does make sense. And I think that's something that is overlooked. It's an advantage to be able to look at these leaderboards and look at the lineups and break them down and say, okay, this is what it takes. This guy had 4 chalk players and he had 4 contrarian players. That's stuff that you can look at. It's free, and you can gain a big advantage from it.
Yeah, and I think going off that, like, the best thing you do is really just aggregate all these things and just try to find some common trends and common themes that you can apply to your own work. It's the best thing out there, because it's like what's proven and what actually worked, and what better tool and advantage can you gain than actually having something that's tried and proven. All right, so let's talk about some like general things you can do in tournaments. Jay touched on a lot of them. With respect to like over-unders, what would you say with regards to fading the high totals, the high implied team totals of the night, and maybe going and targeting those teams that are like kind of in the mid range and in that 98, 95 to 100 range, where they're not Golden State, they're not 105 implied, but there is some value in there to be had.
Yeah, it's for sure, the size of the tournament, it's plus EV to kind of, fade those. If you look at a game and you look at players in that game and think, okay, these are such obvious plays, then that gives you enough reason right there. If you're throwing in one entry, hoping to cash out 30,000 or whatnot, then you can comfortably fade them. The way the NBA works is that this stuff doesn't happen like Vegas says every night. There are blowouts every night. There are close games every night. They're supposed to be blowouts. So that's something that you look at on a maybe each night basis, say, okay, this strategy doesn't work. But over time, to win one of these tournaments, that's something that you have to do. And you have to kind of fade guys that are in too easy of spots where for cash, you'd be like, okay, this guy's an auto play. That's almost like an auto fade in tournaments.
Agreed.
I don't agree with that. I don't think it's an auto fade completely, because
I get more so a game, like an entire game of 218 over under or something. And everybody's going to be on that core of guys. That's something you can look at. And it doesn't mean you have to go and play the Miami guys in a 189 total, but those mid-range 195, close spreads even, sometimes people don't attack, and there is overtime possibility and that's something that you kind of have to have on your side every now and then to win one of these.
No, I agree. I just don't think we should completely fade one, like a complete game, because I think we talk about ownership, and like it's super important, like to obviously like a plus EV move is to fade the highest owned guys, because then you put yourself in a situation where if they don't hit, then obviously you're in a good spot. But I think more importantly than like the ownership of one player, like you're looking for a combination of 9 players that is going to be unique and score a lot of points. Like that is what you need. So I think that you can still get exposure to the top games while creating unique lineups in other ways.
Let me counterpoint that to 2 points, and then I'll kick it back to you, Bryan. First is that in certain spots, with basketball being pretty predictable in general, that like even if I want to play, even if like I don't know, the Clippers are super high team total or whatever, and they're in a great spot, everybody's on them. Like I can't be really contrarian in who I decide to play on the Clippers, because everybody knows it's CP3, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre. Like they're not like, I can't play the wide receiver 2 like Golden Tate over Calvin Johnson, for example, because I know that there's going to be limited usage and certain guys are going to see a bulk of the possessions. And my second counterpoint is that I do agree with you for sure, but what I will say is that when you kind of have the similar high-owned building blocks as some people do, it generally leads to similar roster construction. So like if you're playing like stars and scrubs, or you're starting out your roster with like 2 of the more popular guys, then you and whoever else owns those guys are more likely to have similar type players around them just because of the salary cap constraints.
Yeah, I guess potentially. I think naturally I try to build my lineup from the bottom up. So I focus on like what's my core, what are the best values of the day, like the projected plus minus. And I kind of build around my core. So like CP3, even in a over under of 218 or whatever it is, probably isn't going to be my core just because there's even though he may even have a projected plus minus, just that his salary level is around guys with super high ceilings, as opposed to the guys that are value. There's no one around them that I can necessarily pivot to and still get the same value. So I'm going to build my core around those guys, and then go to the top guys. So then I'll filter in CP3 in a lineup, and then I'll filter in Blake in a lineup. So that keeps my core unique while still hitting the top plays in CP3 and Blake.
So let me ask this to you, Jay, too. Is the way we start our rosters different in tournament and cash? Because for cash, I generally like to start close to the top, because those like super like obvious value plays are often guys who with shaky floors, which I'm not like eager to jump on them in cash. Like,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think, it's kind of different. It's slate dependent too, a lot of it. I don't really have any super hard rules with NBA. It's so different on a day-to-day, slate to slate. It's a little more even now that we don't have as many like 12-game slates and 3-game slates back-to-back nights and stuff. But roster construction changes, just like that on a 4-game slate for tournaments. I think on a 4-game slate, it makes a lot more sense to fade that obvious high-scoring game in tournaments. Whereas, like a 12-game slate, you can pile up on the, play some core guys in that highest owned slate.
Yeah, and I think like in tournaments, you want guys like you want to put yourself in a position where you're taking guys who, and sometimes I even do this where I like subtract their ceiling from their floor to see the biggest discrepancy players. And like those are guys that you like in tournaments because they could either go really off or they could go really low, which is great. So that's kind of why I build from the bottom with values and then take guys who I don't really care if they don't hit because they have a ceiling of 70 points or whatever. Whereas in cash, I don't really care about their ceiling at all. And I want to minimize the difference between their ceiling and floor. I want to get guys who are going to be in a narrow range, like Paul Millsap.
Yeah. Like you said, range of outcomes, right? You want a wide range of outcomes in tournaments and a more narrow range of outcomes in cash. It's predictability, it's consistency, it's being able to predict what they will do on a given night, the volatility of their values. All right, so one other thing that I want to touch on for tournaments, and we talked about a couple of times, Bryan, is correlation. Not only So there's two types of correlation. I think the natural, like more popular version of correlation is two teammates and quarterback, wide receiver type thing. And in basketball, it might be Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, or KD and Russell Westbrook. So I'll toss it to you. There's another type of correlation that you've touched on, is kind of thought correlation. And Jay touched on it too earlier in this pod about like making assumptions about a game and then just kind of like building one on top of each other. And if this happens and that happens and that happens types of thing. So I'll toss it to both you guys, Bryan first, and then give your thoughts on both types of correlations and your strategies on both.
Yeah, so the first type of correlation, the teammate correlation, I don't really put any stock into that in the NBA, because really, like if you're looking at NFL or MLB, you're concerned, like the correlation value is when one teammate does well, it means the other teammate is going to do well because of that reason. Whereas the NBA, that doesn't really exist. Like CP3 and Blake and DeAndre is kind of the example we all use, but CP3 is not really dependent upon any of those other guys for his production, whereas NFL, like you have receivers who are, and there's just not really those examples. Even DeAndre with his rebound, he's not really dependent on CP3. So I really only use those correlations. It's not even correlations. I only use stacks like that because it gives me unique lineups in tournaments. But yeah, so the other sort of correlation, which I do put value into, is something that I've written about recently and we've talked about, is the thought correlations. In that, in a tournament, any play you're making, really just anything, any decision that you make, you're making an assumption. So if you say, okay, I am playing DeMarcus Cousins, then you're assuming that he is going to do well. You're assuming he's going to beat the other players at his similar price point and his position, because you assume that by putting him to your lineup. So with one assumption, that creates a thought ladder, is what I called it. And you can follow that down and say, okay, well, if DeMarcus Cousins does well, what does that do for the rest of the NBA? Does that hurt someone on the other team, or does it bump up the total? So maybe I want to target one of the high usage guys on the other team and potentially pair them together, because if Boogie's going to have a big game, then maybe the other guy on the other team with a high usage rate is going to have a big game. You can kind of follow these thought trends. And so it gives you the kind of this free upside into your lineup without really like having to necessarily force it in. And it's something that I don't think really anyone's thinking about, honestly.
Yeah, not too many people do really break down games like that. And some of the most successful tournament players that I've tracked do exactly that. You know, they understand how games can play out and what would happen if A happens, B happens. But before that, I will get into the correlation. I think it is important to note for correlation to not really play two guys on the same team who are very ball dominant. I think you can have a lot of success with, you know, pick and roll guys like Reggie Jackson and Andre Drummond is a pairing that I will employ a lot coming up. I think they're both, you know, still rising. And I think Andre having a huge game won't cut into Reggie, you know, having a huge game. They correlate really well.
But I would say that they don't correlate really well. I would say that they don't hurt each other. Like, that's the difference between
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, but guys who are ball dominant, it's more so just speaking on playing multiple players on a team. If you want to stack a team. And another thing I like doing that's overlooked is in these fast-paced games, you have a lot of small forwards who can play the 2, the 3, the 4. You know, you have Aminu, you have Trevor Ariza, guys who have big minutes. They might not have high usage rates, but they can rack up a lot of stats in these types of games where if you say, okay, this game's going to be 112 to 110, you look at guys like Ariza, you know, he's going to get steals. He's going to be wide open for threes. He's going to be running the floor. He's going to get assists, rebounds. In games like that, I think those types of guys are overlooked. Like, you compare him with Harden, and that's no problem, even though Harden is totally ball dominant. So that's something to look at, I think, with pairing players that a lot of people don't really look at. And as far as breaking down games, you know, the thought ladder, I completely agree. You know, you have to play it out like that for these big tournaments because you need everything to go right. So you have to have these scenarios in your head that match each other for each play. You know, what is the cause and effect? If Boogie goes for 55 and 15, you know, what does that do to his teammates? You know, who else gets points out of that? And I think game-wise, you know, with spreads especially, people are really quick to write off even 10-point spreads, as in that's going to be a blowout. So you can have a huge advantage by playing the starters in that game. And the other thing is, like, for the Thunder or some other teams where they're thin in points, if they're 15-point favorites and they win by 15, the reason they win by 15 is because of those players. It's not like, you know, Andre Robertson's going to get hot in strokes and threes. You're still going to have value even in blowouts because the fact that it is a blowout is because of them.
Yeah, let me add something to the thought ladder. And it might be a little, I don't know, iffy, but I think like employing the thought ladder actually in a way mitigates your risk a little bit, because if you have like 9 different players from 9 different games, you kind of have to nail 9 game flows correctly for all those guys to hit, right? Like you can't have a blowout and one of them and like one guy sits, right? Or like one guy gets I don't know, they like to get up tempo and a big man from one game is underutilized. So like when you use the thought ladder and you can kind of have one thought and everything kind of flowing from it, if you nail that one thought, then all the other stuff will generally be more correct. And it kind of like, it lessens like the number of thoughts and
you have to be less right.
Flows, right. Game flows that you have to nail.
Yeah, I agree. It's harder to be right on 9 things than it is to be right on one thing. So if you just hit that one thing, then obviously, everything kind of flows from there. I would say on the stacking the teammates, I really like the Drum and Reggie thing. I would say in football, you're looking for positive correlation. Like the correlation between 2 teammates is additive. Like they together raise what their ceilings would have been. Whereas in basketball, you're looking for teammates that are non-subtractive. So you're not even looking for guys who like would help each other, because I don't think that exists. But you're looking for guys who don't hurt each other, because you're going to get the discount in a unique lineup. I don't think it does really anything for the projection of your points. It's really all about ownership. So you're not even looking for guys who are going to help each other, just guys who are not going to hurt each other potentially.
I actually think like the better strategy in terms of game stacking is opponent stacking versus teammate stacking, just because sometimes teammates can limit each other's ceilings and steal each other's usage a little bit. But if you opponent stack, if you stack one guy it's kind of like the thought ladder. Like you assume that a game is going to be really up tempo, high scoring, and you play one guy from one team. I think it's really profitable to play another guy from the other team, just because they're going to have to like go at each other and kind of balance each other out if it's going to be a close game.
Yeah, and this thought process, it's so underutilized. People don't break down scenarios. They take it as, face value for Vegas. If Vegas says a team's going to win by 14.5, then that's a blowout, and a lot of people write that off. So there's so much value to be that's an easy way to be contrarian, is to flip these Vegas lines, because it happens all the time. So it's a really simple way to gain value and have low ownership if you want to take that route and saying, maybe this game will be close, and it happens more often than you think.
Yeah, and you only have to make one definitive claim on that. Like you like to say like the Pacers are projected to score low points. Like it's not like you have to make a ton of like just random contrarian plays. Like just start with the Pacers are going to outperform what Vegas says, and then start from there and then say, okay, what is that going to do? Okay, I think that Paul George is going to outscore his projection. Okay, well then put Paul George in your lineup and then say, okay, if he does that, then from where? Like you don't have to make all these crazy claims like Justin said, where you have to hit 9 different game flows. Just start with one thing in your lineup and then work from there, and then kind of see where your lineup takes you.
Yeah, and I like going on to what Jay said too, like the over-unders and the spreads too, like if you look at kind of the percentage of times a team covers a spread or like exceeds their projected team total or whatever, then it's like close to 50-50. Like Vegas is not right all the time. And really in tournaments, it's all or nothing. Like you want to be top 5, and it doesn't matter if you're really 200th or 12,000th, really, bottom line. So like you just need to hit these assumptions, one or a couple of times to really get that big score. And be a little out of the box, but that's what you really need to be profitable in these tournaments.
Yeah, and single entry wise, there's not one formula that will make you win tournaments. It's something that it changes each night. You can have a strategy and stick to it. You can maybe throw, in the dollar tournament, you can throw one in every night, and you can continue to pound, maybe these blowouts, and you can assume they're going to be close and it could hit sooner than not. But you got to understand, it changes so often, and there's no secret that says if you do this, you're going to win. It's a process, and for tournaments, for large fields, it can take weeks before you see some return on it.
Yeah, maybe we can close this with kind of just like final thoughts on advice for people, whether it be playing or using labs. I'll close with one thought that I have on just using our tools and our models. I think that's just don't shortcut. And that's, I think people are out there looking for ways to just click their mouse 3 times, and then optimize and then win $20,000. It doesn't work like that. You have to put in time, put in legwork, put in research to end up being a profitable player. There is no shortcuts here. Bales and Peter Jennings, those guys put in crazy hours doing research and do their own thing and look into the numbers and do stuff outside of labs, on their own, just making assumptions and things like that. I would strongly advise against just coming in and using just a straight optimal lineup blind, because I think in order for you to be a profitable player and really be in this long term and just not just be a one and done potentially, you kind of have to know what you're doing and really understand why you're playing players, and just not blindly put someone in, not knowing why. And I think, even take another step, use our trends. You want to look at how this player does, in parameters that fit his parameters for that day. What his projected plus minus has been in the past. Just do a little simple trend search and see if this spot is conducive to him outperforming his projection. So I think just in general, I would say that you kind of have to put a little bit more work in, kind of understand why you're playing players, and put in a little research before just putting your lineup together. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the greatest thing is about all that is that we have so many tools that are right there for you to look at. Before this was around, the amount of work to gather this all in one spot, it took your entire day. It was nearly impossible, along with dealing with, you had to find out who all the injuries are. So I think our greatest source is that we have all of these statistics right there. We have all of the breaking news right there. You don't have to go elsewhere, but you do have to spend time breaking it down, playing with our trends, playing with our projections, what works for you. And, my last note will be, I think there are a lot of different reasons why people are playing DFS. Are you in it for long-term? Are you in it for a quick score? Does your mind work more towards a cash game player? If you see yourself looking at players and saying, there's no way I'll ever play this guy, he doesn't have a good matchup, you might be more cash game based. And then the other point is, if you find yourself playing guys who are really low owned, if you're in double ups every night, and you have guys in your cash game that are 4% owned every night, you might want to take that towards tournaments and employ that strategy, because that's the type of mindset. So for cash games, looking at our system and stuff, we give great plays and you can build great teams, but don't get cute in cash games when you're playing, large fields, doubling up. You just want to beat 50%. There's no need to play guys who are questionable. There's no need to play guys who have low floors and are low owned. You don't need to go completely chalk. You have to understand there's a thin line. There's a difference between that.
Yeah, and don't get cute in cash games, and don't get frustrated in tournaments. That's my biggest advice is, we do pods and we work really hard on the models. We put a lot of hours into the projections and the news and these podcasts and videos, and we're going to miss on a ton of plays, and it's just going to happen. And tournaments, you're going to go a long time. You're going to go many days without not winning a tournament. That's just the nature of GPPs. So I would say don't get frustrated. I know that's kind of not what you want to hear, because everyone wants to just click 3 times on their computer and win 20K and it just be that easy. But don't get frustrated. If you put in the time, you'll get rewarded. It may not be in 3 days, but you'll eventually become a better DFS player and eventually be rewarded for grinding it out. But it's probably not going to be on your first day of using Fantasy Labs, or maybe your second day, but we'll do our best to help you guys to win over the long run.
Yeah, I think coming back, it's all about process versus results. I think people are so results oriented that it's super frustrating. I can think of so many examples. Dellavedova the other day, he put up 15-9 in that start where he was dealing with that injury. And he was going to be in a minutes limit coming in. He played 24 minutes. And if you look at 15-9, you're like, wow, Delly was a really good play that day. But I encourage you guys to just look at the thought process and the reasoning behind why you make decisions, rather than just looking at pure results and basing your thoughts on that. Because if you're doing that, you're just going to be chasing a ghost. Like, you're not going to be ahead of the curve. You're not going to be able to like predict things in the future. You're just going to be one step behind all the time, just like one game behind chasing these guys who break out. Like, it's not a way to be profitable. So what we try to do here, and what Bryan said, is we'll try to go out on a ledge oftentimes, and make some more bold calls. And sometimes they don't work out, sometimes they do, but we're more about the process and the results for sure.
Yeah, and like Jay and I talked about it in the pod that we did. I guess you're going to see it right before this one, in the video for the Wednesday slate. Like, your best DFS players, like, a lot of people got really frustrated because we pubbed Karl Anthony Towns the other night really hard because of his matchup, and he dudded. Like, he just didn't do well. And a lot of people got frustrated, and Jay and I were both talking about when that happened, like, we salivated. Like, that was enticing to us because we realized that he's not going to be that way the next game. And while people are going to fade him or potentially have recency bias, we're already looking ahead to the next game instead of getting frustrated. And we're seeing, okay, that means he's going to be an incredible value next game because of the dud. So always be kind of looking for edges even in your failures.
Yeah, it really is all about the process. And I can attest to that, seeing people come and go, guys who get too cute with their cash game lineups, or they take Dellavedova, night after night, Kirk Heinrich night after night, chasing points or stuff like that, that it might hit short term and you can brag about it one night. But, in my experience, that does not last and you will be a losing player. So here, we're really trying to train you on your successful processes that have been proven. And that's really what it's all about. I don't want to give anybody advice that I haven't personally had success with. So I think there's a lot of information you can find valuable, and points chasing isn't one of them. And, everything we say it means something based on our previous history and what has worked that's been proven.
Yeah, we'll never like try to steer you wrong just to try to benefit ourselves in our own plays. Like if I assure you, like, if I say I really love Karl Anthony Towns in a podcast and he does, like, you can complain to me, but like, I'm also feeling it too because I played him. Like, I play the players that I pub because I believe in them. I'm not, we're not going to give you guys that we don't believe in. So we can just be in misery together, I guess.
All right, guys. I think we went a little longer than we expected, but I think we covered a lot of ground. This is kind of long overdue, and I think adding Jay to the mix really enhanced what we can offer, because he's definitely the most experienced player out of the three of us. So
he's okay.
Yeah, I mean, he plays a little bit too much JOB, but that's.
Can you play too much JOB?
It's not possible. No.
All right. Sounds good.
I mean, this is some Thanksgiving fodder for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process, and it's not right away. It's hard at this point in the game. Back in the day, it was a lot easier to come in and have small edges, or the edges were bigger, and now they're smaller. So you've really got to refine your strategy and tighten up on places that EV here and there is crucial to your long-term ROI.
Yeah, and DFS is fun. It's fun to play. Fantasy sports is fun. I enjoy it. It's Thanksgiving.
Ignore your family. Watch this podcast and eat a lot of food. Enjoy your football. Enjoy the luck-based DFS board, and then come back to us.
Yeah, don't enjoy football. Football sucks. Yeah, get out of there with that. All right, guys. Happy Thanksgiving. You will have Jay and Justin talking to you later this week, and I will see you next week. But good luck in your contest, and happy Thanksgiving again. All right, we're out.